Hello everybody, welcome to this video. In this class, I'll be treating punctuation at a higher level. I'll try my best to be as simple as possible, but the target audience are people who already have a background knowledge of punctuation generally. However, if you're preparing for the SAT test or any English proficiency test, you want to have an advanced knowledge of punctuation beyond just the basic level of understanding. And that's because it helps you get a good score on the grammatical range and accuracy. It also helps you to um, be a better writer. It improves coherence and cohesion because the truth is, punctuation plays a huge role in how people understand what you're trying to say. So in this class, I'll be treating punctuation, just as I mentioned. Um, so let's begin. The core concepts and rules with examples. The first we have here is quotations and continuing sentences. When a quoted fragment appears inside the sentence and the sentence continues immediately after the quote, punctuation that connects the quote to the rest of the sentence usually appears inside the closing quotation mark. It could be a comma, it could be a period. Now, what that means is if there is a quote in a sentence, not the entire, like let's say you have a sentence that's ongoing and there's a quoted sentence in that quote. If the sentence continues after the quotation, then the punctuation has to be inside the quotation. Why is that the case? The punctuation mark is functioning to connect the quoted phrase to the sentence that follows. Placing the comma inside the quote preserves the flow. Let me show you examples. Look at this is a sentence and there is a quote inside the sentence. Because the sentence continues after the quotation, the sentence did not end after the quotation, it continues, then that would imply that the comma needs to be inside the quotation. She called it a miracle. The miracle is in quotes, and that's why the comma is in the quotation. This is, by the way, American style, which is usually what is expected of you in the SAT test when it comes to punctuation. Look at the next one. He called you an idiot, which you knew it did not mean seriously. So you see, it continues. How do we know it continues? Because what comes after the quotation is not a complete thought on its own. It's a continuation. I can't just come to you and say surprising everyone in the room. You'd wonder what I mean by surprising everyone in the room. I can't just come to you and say which you knew he did not mean seriously. You would already know that that's a continuation of a previous sentence, and therefore the punctuation that follows should be a comma in in the quote. Look at this wrong one. She called it a miracle, surprising everyone. The comma is outside, and that's wrong. He called me an idiot, which I knew he did not mean seriously. This is wrong because if there's a full stop, then this is a sentence fragment. We've discussed sentence fragments in the past, which I knew it did not mean seriously. This is not a complete thought and therefore cannot stand on its own. So this should be a comma in here rather than a full stop outside. I hope that's clear. Always have the punctuation inside the quote if the sentence still continues. Okay, let's go on. Now let's talk about parenthetical words and interrupters. By that, I'm referring to words like though, however, indeed. Words like though, however, indeed, in fact, after all, and so on can act as interrupters and are set off by commas on both sides when they appear inside a sentence. So, just as you can see it here, you have comma on both sides of though. You see. Now, if the interrupter appears at the end of the sentence, it needs the appropriate punctuation before it. So, word though. Let me give you a tip. Watch the structure that follows. If what comes after the interrupter is an independent clause, you know what an independent clause is, right? Something that makes sense on its own. You must not simply place a comma before and then leave the clauses joined only by a comma. That will create a comma splice. We've talked about comma splice in the past, but let me explain one more time. A comma splice occurs when you join two independent clauses. Two independent clauses with just a comma. When you join two independent clauses with just a comma, you've made a comma slice, and that's wrong grammatically or in terms of punctuation. So you must be careful when when separating interrupters with commas on both ends. If what follows is a complete thought, and what came before was also a complete thought, there has to be a semicolon either here or here, depending on which part of the sentence the though is attributed to. Look at this. He is talented. However, he will do well. Do you see the correct use of punctuation there? He is talented, however, he will do well. In this case, if you wrote he is talented, however, and then the semicolon comes before the however and the comma after the however, it will be wrong. Why? Because if you include the however with he will do well, you're suggesting that this entire clause contrasts with he is talented. Remember, however suggests contrast, isn't it? I'll try to break this down as much as I can. However suggests contrast. So if there is however beginning the clause, it suggests that it's contrasting the previous clause. So in this case, however accompanies the first sentence. This suggests that it is contrasting something that came earlier and not what comes next. For instance, if I say, let me give it context. John is playful. That's the first sentence. He is talented, however. So you see, however here is showing that it is contrasting with the fact that he is playful, which you may think will stop him from doing well in his exam. So he is talented, however, he will do well. So he will do well is a complete thought on its own, hence the semicolon before it. The same thing here, he is talented, however, and will do well. This is correct because we have a comma and here to indicate that what comes next is a complete thought. By the way, ellipsis has occurred here, an omitted subject. He will do well. So he is talented, comma. He is talented, however, and he will do well. So this is a complete thought. He is talented, however. Another complete thought. He will do well. And if you notice, there's a comma here. If you remember in the class on sentence structure, we agreed that there are two ways to join two independent clauses. I've told you how not to join them, When you have two independent clauses, you don't join them with just a comma. There are two ways to join two independent clauses. You either join them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction like and, or just a semicolon. Look at this incorrect comma splice, or this incorrect expression due to the occurrence of a comma splice. He is talented, however, he will fail. You see, this is wrong because in this case we have, a complete thought here, There should be a semicolon here and then a comma here. He is talented, however, he will fail. So you see, a complete thought. She loved math, however, she hated tests. Another complete thought, So this should be, she loved math, however, she hated tests. So be careful when picking the semicolon, where to put the semicolon and the comma, because at times, knowing where the however should be relies on how it is related to the clause it accompanies. She loved math. If she loves math, she should do well, isn't it? But what comes next contradicts the previous one. That's why, however, goes with this one, not with this one. All right. Colon. Colons are used for introducing. Colons are used to introduce. You could use to introduce an explanation. You could introduce a list. That's what I mean by enumeration. Or it could be to introduce, maybe to elaborate, to explain. And they always follow an independent clause. That's something you must know. They always follow an independent clause. The clause before the colon must be able to stand alone. That is, must be able to make complete meaning on its own. What follows the colon can be a list, a single word, a phrase, or a full independent clause that explains or expands on the first. Look at this. Shade brought the following. This is a complete thought. Then a list. A bag, pen, and ball. She had one goal. This is a complete thought. What follows is win the prize, an elaboration. He faced a choice, move or stay, a phrase. He didn't say why, he simply let two independent clauses. Okay? So I think that's straightforward. Look at this incorrect one. Because he was late, the meeting started up without him. This is wrong because if there is a colon, what comes before has to be a complete thought, and this is a dependent clause, not an independent clause, so it's not a complete thought. A colon cannot follow an incomplete thought. Now, look at this. Capitalization after a colon. Different style guides vary, but for set purposes, if what follows is a complete sentence, capitalization of the first word is acceptable but not required. The safer route is to pay attention to the answer choices and pick the one that preserves sentence integrity. If there is a colon, check that the part before could stand alone as a complete sentence. That's key. Now, semicolons, which is where I want to do the bulk of the explaining. Semicolons. Semicolons do the same thing as a comma and together. A comma plus and. A comma plus and is basically a comma plus and is equal to just a semicolon. So, use the semicolon to join two closely related independent clauses when they are not connected by a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunction there would mean fanboys. Any of the fanboys. This is a mnemonic for you to remember. We have for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So semicolons can also be used to separate items in a complex list. So now you know two ways semicolons can be used. First, to join two independent clauses. Also, to separate items in a complex list. You get an example now. Look at the first one. He studied hard. He still failed the exam. You see, in these cases, we have two independent clauses separated by a semicolon. Assuming you put a comma here instead of semicolon, you would have a comma splice, which is wrong. The meeting included George, the manager, Lisa, the head of sales, and Priya, the accountant. So this is a complex list in the sense that George and the manager are the same persons. So if you just say George, comma, the manager, comma, Lisa, comma, you see it begins to feel as if George is a different person from the manager. But to make it clear that George and the manager are the same people, you say George, the manager, semicolon. Lisa, comma, the head of sales, semicolon. So you see that helps to separate each individual. So semicolons can be used in complex lists like this. The meeting included George, the manager, Lisa, the head of sales, and Priya, the accountant. We could have just said the meeting included George, Lisa, and Priya. They mean the same thing. Just that because this one is complex, we have semicolons. Common SAT trap. Don't use a semicolon if the second clause is not independent. Don't use a semicolon if the second clause is not independent. A dependent clause beginning with because, as, since are, those are dependent clauses, so don't use a semicolon there. Use a comma or rearrange it. Alright. Comma splices. You've heard me talk about comma splices repeatedly. So if you did not get it before, here's another opportunity for you to get it right. A comma splice occurs when two independent clauses are joined with only a comma. This is something you see a lot in the SAT test, so you must be aware. Remember, two independent clauses should form a compound sentence and should only be separated by a semicolon or a comma and or a comma and any coordinating conjunction. So, how do you fix a comma splice? You could replace the comma with a semicolon. You could replace the comma with a period and then capitalize the next word. You could insert a coordinating conjunction after the comma, that is like and, or you could just restructure it such that the second clause becomes dependent, and that way it's no longer a comma splice. Look at this. I studied all night, comma, I was exhausted the next day. This is a comma splice because we have two independent clauses. Independent clause 1, independent clause 2, and they are joined by a comma, which is wrong. Why? You can only separate independent clauses with a semicolon or a comma plus a coordinating conjunction like and. So this is a better way to say it. I studied all night. Remember what we said. You could either replace the comma with a semicolon, such as I studied all night, semicolon, I was exhausted the next day. Or you could separate them with a period and capitalize the next word. For instance, I studied all night, full stop. I was exhausted the next day. Also, you could insert a coordinating conjunction after the comma. I studied all night, comma, so I was exhausted the next day. So is a coordinating conjunction. Remember, fanboys. All right. Let's proceed to participial and introductory phrases. A participial phrase, such as positing that or running down the hall, may continue the sentence. If the phrase is meant to modify the main clause and continue the sentence, do not end the sentence with a period, unless it's intended to be a new sentence. Punctuation should reflect whether the phrase is dependent or starts a new independent clause. So this is what you should note. Participial phrases can either begin an independent clause or modify the main clause. and continue the sentence. Look at this. The professor explained the theory, adding several examples. In this case, we have a participial phrase that is continuing the sentence and modifying the main clause. Adding several examples modifies the explaining of the theory. A participial phrase simply contains an ing verb, a non-finite verb. So here we don't have a finite verb, so it's a phrase. Adding several examples. Remember, a phrase is a group of words that does not contain a finite verb. So in this case, a participial phrase is functioning as a modifier to a main clause. Therefore, will be separated by a comma because it is not a complete thought on its own. So yes, a comma will explain it. It would be wrong to separate them with a full stop because it is not a complete thought on its own. The professor explained the theory, adding several examples. This would be wrong. This is correct because it begins an independent clause. Adding several examples, the professor explained the theory. Remember, I told you it can either continue a main clause by modifying it, or it could introduce an independent clause. So here it introduces, adding several examples, the professor explained the theory. Okay? Let's take a look at some examples. The poet wrote that freedom is life in the raw, praising the courage of the people. I think it's an error here. The poet wrote that freedom is life. Anyway, the goal here, this is an error on my part, but the goal here was just to indicate that the comma should be inside the quote, just as we explained earlier. Let's look at another one. The course offered modern techniques, though, as a gateway to successful career, many students consider it essential. I think this one is obvious. The though should be followed by a colon. Because if you use a comma, you'll be wrong. From as a gateway to essential is a complete thought. As a gateway to a successful career, many students consider it essential. It's a complete thought. Many students consider it essential. So there has to be a semicolon here. A is correct. Because a comma here on both sides will lead to a comma splice. It cannot be C because it does not negate the previous one. Though has to be with the previous one instead of the next one. Because if it's with the next one, it will suggest that the next one contradicts this first sentence, and it doesn't. So it has to go with this first sentence, suggesting that it contradicts something that was not provided. The course offered modern techniques. As a gateway to successful career, many students consider it essential. So obviously, it doesn't contrast with this sentence. So the though cannot come with this. The colon after the interrupter is acceptable because the first part is independent and the clause after the colon elaborates. Remember what we said that when there is a colon, it could introduce a list, it could introduce an elaboration. Okay. Semicolon versus comma splice. She wanted to practice more, dash she didn't have time. Now you see, she didn't have time is a complete thought. She wanted to practice more is also a complete thought. So, however, there should be a semicolon somewhere because both of them are complete thoughts. So, she wanted to practice more. She didn't have time. She didn't have time contradicts the first sentence. So A is correct because however should go with this next one. D is also correct because we said there are two ways to fix a comma splice. You either add a semicolon or a full stop. So D is also correct. So, common traps on the SAT test. Comma splice disguised by a parenthetical word. The fact that there's a parenthetical word there does not mean there should be two. There necessarily has to be two commas on both ends. Be careful so you don't have a comma splice. If both sides contain an independent clause, then we can't have two commas separating the parenthetical word. Period inside quotation marks when sentence should continue. This is wrong because when there's a sentence continuing, there cannot be a period inside the quote. It has to be a comma. Number 3, using colon after an incomplete clause. That's not possible. If it is an independent clause, it has to be followed by a comma, not a semicolon. Semicolon with a dependent clause, that's the same thing. Capitalization errors. A capital letter in the middle of a sentence often signals an incorrectly split sentence. So there's a problem somewhere there. All right. So this is a practice test for you. I'm going to scroll from 1 to I think 5, right? Yeah, so 1 to 5. I want you to pause to answer each question, and then you can take a look at the answers at the bottom. Pause it, answer the questions. Do not cheat. And then answer the questions which have been get to the answers to the questions as have been provided. So you can always pause to, see if what you picked is correct. I recommend watching the video as many times as possible so you can have a good grasp of punctuations at an advanced level. On this note, I have come to the end of the class. We'll see you in the next class. Thank you. See you soon.